In terms of major changes that have we've seen in the volunteer arena, I think I've gone through a series of thoughts on this over the last 15 years. Interestingly, in 2006, I tried to write a paper, and I did write this paper, and it ended up being a more subtle name, but in the beginning I wrote a title that my board rejected, which was "Volunteers Don't Matter." And what I was trying to get at back in 2006 was that there seemed to be an abdication of the desire to volunteer in serious ways, especially at the Chamber of Commerce level. Now, I run an association of chambers of commerce and their leaders, and so it was a sort of a revelation as I dug into some research, and going all the way back to bowling alone research, that just seemed to indicate that people were bailing out. In some ways, Sarbanes-Oxley was forcing this issue. In other ways, the international management was driving it, and sometimes it was just kind of tired and a difficulty with people just being kind of reaching a fatigue factor. But something interesting happened when the recession hit. And what happened that I've seen in terms of a kind of a shift was, at least at the Chamber of Commerce level, was that the volunteers were back. And it started to be almost to the point where some chamber execs who had gotten kind of comfortable just being in charge on their own and running things the way they wanted to, kind of told people to put their hands down. You know, they weren't interested in this kind of direct management that they hadn't seen for years, and then it was starting to come back, and volunteers were pitching in and helping in ways that they hadn't before. And at ACCE itself, we never really had that gap of volunteers that didn't want to participate. We have had strong volunteer leadership for our own association, but both Susan and I work for organizations that the members themselves are associations. And that makes it kind of interesting for us to have a two-sided approach to this question of volunteering. We've tried a lot of techniques and attempts to try to capture volunteer work more effectively, volunteer engagement more effectively. Most of them, the formal ones, by the way, especially using new technology, have not been very successful. You know, self-service portals for membership and things like just a volunteer engagement checklist and all those kinds of things have not been very successful. But what we find is that the most valuable thing that volunteers bring to our own association, and I think for chambers it's the most valuable thing as well, is that when they dial in or speak up, or it's just priceless, the information that they bring us, the responses that they bring us to questions are critical. But I think the difference that's going on right now in board volunteerism is that the engagement is sort of around the greater good more than it is around trying to run the organization. And trying to assist and volunteer in running things has really been pushed off the shelf for the most part, both at ACCE and for chambers. More and more, I think the thing that's happened most is that this whole electronic age has made it so people can communicate in lots of different ways and high speeds. And really, you know, electronic communication is preferred over coming to visit, even on some complex questions. I think people are so used to it and want it as their primary communication that the notion of gathering has become, for any purpose, has become less appealing. And we don't think that's a tragedy. We just think we have to manage the work differently. Sometimes, of course, you know, volunteers can feel sort of inadequate when they're trying to deal with complex issues about the organization or about the greater good. They feel their own uncertainties about it, and I think it's up to staff more and more to provide clarity, much more these days than in the past. One of the things I was glad about was the mention of boards plural in this question. You know, what are the changes that have happened in boards plural? ACCE's governance and volunteerism really spreads across multiple boards. It's not a single board that runs the place. We have vertical and horizontal subgroups that all have their own leadership. and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but they have their own kinds of leadership. In terms of our members, I think the chambers themselves are feeling a great deal of pressure to perform, and every chamber still runs on committed volunteers. It's totally insufficient. They just don't have the staffing to do everything that they want to do, and so they rely on volunteers to run things, and they always will. But the investor types are really looking for something else. The investors are looking for success and mission success, and not so interested. The largest investors who play in a leadership role and volunteer leadership roles really are trying to get some ROI in terms of advancing the cause, whatever that cause is. But volunteers still matter to the functioning of ACCE and to chambers. They still pitch in. They still have to drive some of the buses. They still are very important for content delivery. And so that's what we're seeing. Volunteer is not a bad word, but it isn't necessarily accurate, I think, sometimes in terms of describing what it is that we get from our members. More and more, I think that centers not on volunteering work, but volunteering concepts and ideas. And those are the volunteer things we need the most. Feedback on the things we're proposing, corrections to early drafts, ideas about where we should go into the future. It's those things that matter most in terms of volunteer engagement for us. And it matters less that they are willing to, help greet somebody at an event. So I'll pass it on now.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. It seems like ASAE and ACCE have a lot in common so far as valuing the volunteers. Just in thinking about how the changes in volunteering and volunteerism may impact associations more broadly. We did some research a few years back. We actually surveyed 20,000 volunteers, and I think associations in general have some really strong things in our favor so far as our own volunteers are concerned. The first is that our members are highly engaged. They're engaged people to begin with. That's their nature, and they have a tendency to be engaged with the associations that they choose to belong to, which is particularly true of individual membership organizations, where ASAE is a good example, where the people who run associations belong to ASAE, and so they're very engaged. The second piece of it is that, and Mick said this, I think, very well, is that people volunteer based on their values. They have a basic desire to help others, and as a part of the association community, really have the desire to help a broader constituency, even as broad as society as a whole. Sometimes when the organization's mission is that broad and related to making an impact on society, which many associations have as their mission, that's another reason why people engage and volunteer. That's particularly true as a motivation for younger people to get involved and to volunteer. If there's an alignment of the mission of the organization with the desire of the individual to volunteer, the chances of that being successful are just much, much greater. So I think we have that in common, but there are some things that the research has told us, and then I'll give you an example of one of the things that ASAE has done to help with the engagement piece of this. So our experience in the research is telling us that many organizations, I know this will sound crazy, don't ask for volunteers. They find themselves making some assumptions about what people who belong to associations ought to be doing, and they're not very clear about what it is that they want people to do and when. So just thinking about the ask itself is instructive, and it can be overlooked. You find that to be true in fundraising as well. As when you ask donors, why haven't you supported XYZ Foundation before, chances are the answer will be because nobody asked. So that's kind of a basic thing, but a volunteer asking another volunteer to get involved and engaged is really powerful. The other, as Mick mentioned, and I think I mentioned earlier, is that the experience itself has to be meaningful. When the work of volunteers drifts away from the work of the organization, both the volunteers and the organization find themselves in not too happy a place. So a lot of care has to be given to be clear about what it is that you want volunteers to do, and to take that a step further and think through how that relates to furthering the organization itself. The other thing about volunteers that we found through the research is a lot of what impacts associations is around the ability of an individual to devote time. We compete with a lot of other organizations, churches, schools, civic organizations, for an individual's time. And so I don't know where each organization stands in that lineup, but just to be aware of that. And the other is to be really keenly aware of the life cycle of the individual. You know, younger professionals with busy lives, young families have less time to devote than maybe people who are further along in their career, et cetera. So those are very personal dimensions that need to be taken into consideration as we think about the ability of people to engage with us. It may not always be the same. The volunteers change through their own lifetime, which is important. You know, one of the things that we found is that in order to give our volunteer groups, our councils and committees, not to mention the board, but I'll just focus on that outer rung of volunteers, of which we have about 900, is to make sure that councils and committees stay on the same course as the organization. So about 4 years ago, we began to include the work of volunteer groups in our overall program of work. And we develop a program of work that we propose to the board every year, and they approve that, and thereby also approve the budget that goes with it. So when we see the work of volunteers rolled up into the overall plan of the organization, it does a lot of things. One, it gives ASAE a sense of the magnitude of the work. We certainly couldn't do it without volunteers stepping up and contributing content and effort behind the projects and programs and services that we have. But the other is it really gives the volunteers a sense of purpose and the knowledge that the work we're asking them to do really does align with furthering the mission and the goals of the organization, which is powerful because that wasn't always the case. I don't know if it's true of other organizations, but I can certainly say it was true of ASAE. Sometimes the projects that our volunteer groups would decide to pursue in a given year really didn't match up with what the organization was doing, and it's very hard to pull back and redirect volunteer groups. So this gives both ASAE as well as our volunteers a very good understanding, a mutual understanding of the work ahead. So that's what we did. It's complex to do that, but it's really worth the effort on a yearly basis. As I mentioned before, ASAE has a lot of talented volunteers who are willing to give their time and their intellect to ASAE, so we're fortunate in that regard. And that's particularly true at the board level. So as we think about how changes in volunteerism have impacted the board, what ASAE finds is that it's not necessarily that people don't have the time or the intent to volunteer at the board level, but rather what we're seeing is that two things. One is our research on governance says that you know, the ideal size board may be a bit smaller than boards have been in the past. And so as we think about right-sizing boards, that creates fewer slots or opportunities for people to serve at the board level, so the process becomes more selective. And then converging with that, you also have a need, and we have a need, to build diversity. So those two things are the key things that I'd like to pick up on that impact our board as we think about those who step up and volunteer at the board level. And I can just give an example from ASAE's own playbook. And I'm thinking back to 2005 when we merged with other organizations. There were 4 organizations that merged, which left us with a huge volunteer structure. And at the board level, that was true as well. And over the course of, say, 2005 to 2010, through attrition and a really systematic approach to reducing the number of people who were involved with the board and creating one board, we have now got it down to 19 board members. And so that's coming from, it was more like 70 as we started this process. So it's hard because as I said, there are fewer volunteer opportunities, but then as you think about a board, and our board is certainly based on the ability to serve as well as leadership and the ability to inform the organization. The qualifications for board members are rather rigorous. When you add into that a commitment to diversity, to build visible diversity and thought diversity into the board, the process becomes even more selective. So at the same time that we made the commitment to overhaul the governance structure of the organizations at that time, we also, or the board, adopted a strategic plan for diversity and inclusion. And in part of that was a very important move on their part to commit at the leadership level to be more diverse and to build diversity. And I would say that of all the goals that we've had, both as an organization as well as a board, this is a difficult one because it takes time. You may not see the changes right away, but you build the diversity over time. So the long-term strategic commitment to making that happen is really, really important. So it's a very deliberate process, and I would think that as you look at the ability of volunteers and the willingness of them to step up and work their way up to the board level, or to be visible leaders within the community so they are selected as board members, that too needs guidance. And so the education curve for this is something that it's the responsibility of the organization to provide, whether it's understanding better how to apply the principles and the commitment to diversity and inclusion in selecting leaders at the board level, or whether it's just teaching volunteers to come up through the ranks and to vary their volunteer experiences so by the time they're ready to step into a board position, they're truly ready to serve. That's a very important responsibility that the organization needs to carry out. So it's being attentive to the structure of the governance itself. It's also being attentive to the diversity and the education. And the last piece that I would add from ASAE's experience is that at one time we had a separate board for a foundation as well as one for ASAE, the C6 entity, and now the board functions as one body. The foundation board is a carve-out of 10 individuals of the 19 who serve a dual role. They both guide the foundation as well as the ASAE board, and where that works really well for us is that it doesn't have there aren't any gaps in communication or direction. The board members, whether they're ASAE or the foundation, are equally informed on both organizations. So it's a very efficient and effective model to have one board with a carve-out. So I just wanted to mention that model because it really requires our volunteers, just 10 of them, to wear the two hats, and so it does require a little bit more of their time. Fortunately, we find that they're very willing to do that and provide us with great leadership. So that's the picture for ASAE. Mick, what would you like to add?
I can't imagine any two boards that are less similar than ASAEs and ACCEs, and yet they both seem to work. ACCE's board has been and continues to be what I call a representative board. We have 65 people on it, and we try to get all of the different buckets full. We have not only ideas and age and visible diversity, as Susan mentioned, but also geographic and size diversity that we have to represent people of different size communities as they take part. And the representative board is a two-directional. It's a feedback-based board so that these representatives all around the country who are a part of our board represent us to those communities and act actively in those regions. And at the same time, they act within their communities to gather information and feed us. So that representative board style is different. Obviously, though, like almost every board in the country, I'm convinced that about every board, maybe even the United States government, runs with about 13 people that actually serve as the primary governing entity. And that's true for us, too. We have a very strong and direct executive committee. Our bylaws allow for the executive committee to act in most cases for the board. And so it's a two-part, it's a bifurcated structure where the executive committee and officers drive the boat and drive the bus, and the rest of this board is very active. But in some ways, the board has become a product. The board members love it. They participate at a very high level. the demand for participation and opportunities on the board is significant, and we just think that this model works for us. We're also convinced that the percentage of people who are calling themselves volunteers in any organization or calling themselves leaders or board members, that you're only going to get a certain percentage, and regardless of how big or small the board is, a relatively small number will be extremely active, and that's what's working for us. And so I think while I would love to think that someday we'll get to be a small board, I'm not sure that that would be the desire. At least if we did, we would probably keep a large trustee group or something that allowed us to maintain that representative body. But a handful of officers obviously know they have to do more. But the overall model that was mentioned earlier stays the same. What do we need to work on and how? Where can our help from us matter? What decisions are needed from us? Those are the kind of things that the board asks. They don't volunteer very often when not asked. And that's just the model that we have here, where they say, basically, you tell us what we need to do, where we need to step up, and we will. And they answer these calls pretty reliably. And one of the things that was mentioned is this issue of time and the time shortage. This is certainly a factor for everybody, but you know, we tend to have just 3 full in-person meetings a year. That seems to be adequate for us. And executive committee only meets mostly by phone, so it seems to work. But this idea of building the bench is difficult, especially with this time scarcity that's occurring all over the country and all over every industry. But the time thing for volunteers, especially for my members, for chambers, the struggle to secure the time needed from volunteers to give their input and their ideas has always been a factor. And when you think back to days 100 years ago when ACCE was founded, those chambers were dealing with even tighter difficulties in finding time, and somebody finally did somehow. But you have to understand that in those days, you know, a plant manager might have a 6-day shift. They would have 6 10-hour days, not counting the volunteering they had to do with church and politics and everything else. So for them to give time to the chamber, which leadership was never really a problem in those days either, somebody stepped forward and got the work done, even when there was a greater scarcity of time than there is now. You know, folks will demonstrate their belief if we supply direction, and they'll supply warnings and early detection of problems in this representative board style, and they'll pitch in when asked. Occasionally, they'll also drive our direction. There was certainly a great, strong push recently for us to look beyond the horizon and to try to figure out where the winds were blowing going forward. And ACCE undertook a substantial project we called the Horizon Initiative. And that was really at the direction of the board to try to look beyond even any 3-year strategic plan, but to figure out where this industry and this movement, the chamber movement, was going. And so occasionally on big stuff, they actually decide in which direction we should go. But then once they dug in, they wanted us to come up with the drafts and us to come up with the research that would provide and make sense. And they wanted to respond to drafts. Increasingly, I'd say that that's the way they want to work. They want to respond to things rather than sit together and try to compose a future plan. When it comes to our members, volunteers, that is people who work for companies and are therefore members of their regional or local chamber or state chamber, the biggest investors are seeking more ROI than opportunities for engagement. And so chambers have to provide this success. The large investors are investing in the community, and the chamber is the conduit. And as such, chambers have to take very deliberate action in order to address the needs of those people who are willing to pay well above any dues rate card and that are investing in the community. And I think that even in organizations that have a strict dues structure, getting the participation and investment in time or money or both from the largest potential investors, either based on their interest level or their capacity to give, I think that's the biggest thing that these thousands of chambers across the country are trying to work on. They're trying to get the revenue tied to the mission. And frankly, a lot of business models for associations and chambers are not set up that way. They tend to be set up in another way, which is to look at direct service and transactional support that's offered by an association or a chamber and try to collect revenue for those transactional activities. And so what we're seeing is a move in another direction, that the initial missions and causes that were established that led to chambers being set up in the first place, and regional economic development entities and other kinds of associations that are based regionally, are working much more deliberately to try to kind of steer the requests and the dues value proposition toward those mission issues instead of toward discounts and butts in seats. So we think that's a very important change that is maybe being felt at the local level first and may graduate to other kinds of national and international associations. So the activists then, whether that's me trying to activate my members or a chamber exec trying to activate his or her members, it's very important to give, I guess what I heard from an old Italian philosopher said, the role of the leader is to give meaning to the work. And so I think it's not so much about asking for the chores to be done by the volunteers as much as it is to make them understand what it is you're trying to do and to give meaning to all the work that the organization is doing and that you're asking for from volunteers. Younger chamber members, by the way, younger companies, younger volunteers, younger activists appear to be especially interested in being involved with a cause and not just with self-perpetuation of an entity, that they want to give their time and energy and attention to things that matter, and they're not so necessarily interested in being part of a joining culture. So with that in mind, the appeal has to be different. And we see that happening at our level with our organization and with our members and all of their thousands of organizations. And so what are they doing? I mean, one of the things that all of us are doing is to try to set up, leadership programs for younger players. The young professionals associations that are launched by chambers, and some of them have become pretty independent, is an important step forward. I think the diversity issues are important for both visible diversity and for kind of this recognition that next gen can't be sitting at the little kids table forever, that they need to be engaged in a way that makes them not feel like tokens at a board group or as the last person asked for their input, but have to be actively courted to be part of that decision-making process. The reality is that a small percentage of newly engaged young folks will ever dig in as real volunteer leaders of our associations. The percentages, we don't need a lot. It's sort of like the military has, so many generals they need at the Pentagon. They don't need hundreds of generals. They need just the right amount. And I think when it comes to volunteer engagement, what we want is an active membership that plays and takes part and uses the resources. And then what we want is people that will elevate from each generation, whether that's the baby boomers or the Xers or the millennials or whatever comes beyond them. We don't have to get everybody. We want to get everybody engaged in the products we have. But in terms of leadership, I think we have to let those who are ready and eager elevate, and that's where I think a lot of the effort is being spent at both the chamber level and here at ACCE. What do you think, Susan?
I'm really glad you brought up the younger professionals, because I think all organizations, from what I hear from associations in a broad sense, is that we're all wondering how to engage younger professionals, because you're absolutely right. It may not be to join the organization, but to become involved and engage in other ways. I think the challenge there is to be there with the right opportunity at the right time with the right person, which is a pretty tall order considering how broad our memberships can be. One of the things that we looked at, both from our research and then in practice, was ASAE probably didn't have enough volunteer opportunities for enough people of, of whatever diversity, including younger professionals. And we've been much more deliberate over the past years in, our ad hoc volunteering opportunities. And those can be things like mentoring. We have a writers pool that sends out our editorial calendar and areas of interest so that those who would like to write articles for newsletters or blog posts or even submit articles for publishing in our magazine will know enough and have a better shot at getting their material accepted. So writing is another way, and just recruiting members. Other members are getting people engaged with ASAE. We've paid a lot more attention to that. We have an ad hoc volunteering community site where these smaller tasks, sometimes some that are under the radar and part of the substructure, can be found, and we get a tremendous response for people who would like to have a short-term involvement. They want to do something, begin, and move on to the next thing, or maybe come back in a while and find something else to do. The thing that we've learned about ad hoc volunteering, though, is that even though it can be a bit under the radar, it's nonetheless really important to recognize the importance of that work to making things happen at ASAE. So we still try to find ways to not only engage but to recognize and thank individuals for the contributions that they've made. So we don't want to overlook that part. And the other thing that we've done is as we looked at the more committed level of volunteers, and as I think I mentioned before, we have about 900 people who serve on boards, committees, and councils that we really look at as the most engaged and committed volunteer group that we have, is we started to hold an annual volunteer leadership retreat in November of every year. And that's probably been one of the biggest steps that ASAE has taken to engage, inform, and really develop committed volunteers. To your point, Mick, about the way in which we bring young leaders along and then they sort of self-select whether they want to go to that next level. This gives our younger volunteers, or those who have less experience with the organization, a great opportunity to see the organization at its best. We've engaged all the boards. We have a board for ASAE and the foundation, of course, but we also have our business services board and our insurance board. They're engaged at the retreat. All of the chairs and vice chairs of all of our councils and committees are invited. Our second-year DELF scholars, those are our diversity executive leadership scholars, we bring to the table. We invite all of the past chairs, and also the senior team for staff team are all engaged. It's about 165 to 170 people, and we bring everyone together, and what we don't focus on is the work at hand. In other words, we tell our volunteers the program of work for this year is settled, and we're on our way with it. The role of this retreat in our planning process and in our strategy is to get our committed volunteers to weigh in on our future as far out as we want to go. It can be anywhere from a year, practically speaking. 5 years is a real stretch, but let's say a year to 3 years of what ASAE should be focused on. And I would encourage any organization who could do something like this to really get face-to-face and elbow-to-elbow with the volunteers, because some amazing things happen. The way this is structured is we have a one-day retreat. And Nick, you had said, lessons learned along the way. The first couple of these were pretty rocky because we just threw open the doors and said, so what do you think? And that didn't work at all because people need guidance. To your point, you need to develop a draft or a model for the volunteers to react to. And when we understood that, our retreats became a lot better. So we decide what the framework of the retreat is going to be, and we work with the chair of the ASAE board to determine that. And then we engage the volunteers in a facilitated process. The next day, the ASAE and foundation boards meet, and they deliberate. What were the outcomes of the retreat? What were the main themes? What does our membership expect us to do? And then they charge staff with developing those ideas. Many of those projects, as they survive through a feasibility phase of development, become the things that we're working on for future years. We've had things like innovation our digital environment, moving from print. We're working on our membership model now. We're developing a whole series of career-related resources. All of these things came about because of our volunteer leadership retreat. And so there's buy-in on the part of the volunteers as well as a lot of focus for ASAE staff as we move forward together. So those are two things that we've done. We've learned a lot in the process, but I don't see how we would be able to guide the organization without them.